Good morning and welcome to the formal opening of the Museum's Aotearoa Conference for 2014. As Philippa said, it is wonderful to be back in Hawke's Bay, 8 years on, and the last conference here I was actually also just newly elected as chair, so it was my first conference. I just wish I'd had the same kind of makeover that this facility has had during that intervening period. It is my job this morning just to read out a message from the Minister of Arts, Culture and Heritage, the Honourable Christopher Finlayson, who unfortunately had hoped to be with us today but has other duties, sort of more pressing engagements for him. However, he has passed this message. I congratulate Museums Aotearoa for another excellent program for this year's conference. As keepers of the nation's taonga, our museums and galleries must consider fundamental issues such as financial viability, access to collections, and opportunities for cooperative ventures. I hope the formal sessions, as well as the informal networking over coffee or a glass of excellent Hawke's Bay wine, and I think we had some of that last night, will prompt fresh approaches and fruitful alliances. No doubt there will be opportunities to further reflect on lessons learnt from the Canterbury earthquakes, whether it be finding new ways to connect with audiences, collective solutions for storage, or the sharing of skills and mentoring programs. The government is continuing its support for major capital projects through the Regional Museums Policy. This year, I was delighted to see a grant go towards the Suta Art Gallery's redevelopment, and I look forward to seeing it when it is completed. The revival of Lottery's Significant Projects Fund has also delivered a considerable boost to several important projects, including a new museum at Waitangi. I am very pleased construction of this museum will start this year and should be completed by Waitangi Day 2016. Over the next 4 years, New Zealanders will have an opportunity to participate in commemorative activities to mark the centenary of the First World War. Our museums and galleries will be key providers of commemorative experiences, interpretive material and exhibitions. I encourage you all to work with the WW100 Programme Office at the Ministry of Culture and Heritage to maximise the impact of these projects. I wish you all the very best for a productive and stimulating conference, and it's signed by the Honourable Christopher Finlayson, Minister for Arts, Culture and Heritage. It's also my pleasure this morning to introduce our first of our keynote speakers, Kate Clark. And as you will have seen from the little biography in the conference program, Kate has worked in numerous museum and heritage organisations in the UK and Australia, with a particular interest in the value of culture and heritage. I think one of the things is if you Google Kate, which we all have to do when we get given these jobs, I think one of her profiles listed 33 individual skills that she had in this sector. So I think her breadth and depth of knowledge is quite impressive, and I'm looking forward very much to what she has to say. But I'd also just like to read you a quote which I think will resonate with many of you that I found on a piece that she had written commenting on the Coalition Arts Policy, which was released in September last year. And she said in that piece, "Yet our cultural heritage defines who we are. The places where we live, work and play are defined by their history. Our memories, traditions and stories shape us as a nation. Our museums, from the smallest local volunteer run to our flagship national cultural institutions, celebrate who we are and where we have come from. Heritage is the poor cousin, forever falling into that gap between arts and environment and planning. Knowing who you are and where you come from is the wellspring for creativity. It is good for our people, places, and the environment." Kate, welcome. Thank you.
Thank you, Therese. I'd forgotten I'd said that. And can I also join in paying my respects to the traditional owners of the land and acknowledge their elders past and present. I was inspired by the welcome, not least because I'd actually learnt that song in my community choir in Wootton-under-Edge in England. So it's a lovely example of Māori culture travelling and all of us sharing in this extraordinary heritage. I also want to thank you for welcoming me to New Zealand. I think there's a huge amount of exciting things happening in New Zealand. We've got a very exciting conference program, and I'm really looking forward to learning a lot. I think we always have the idea that somebody somewhere else is doing something better and forget the quality of what we've actually got at home. The conference today is about the business of heritage. Now, if you're a private sector organisation, you know how you create value in your business. You create value by making money. You create profits and you create value for your customers. But in museums, we're not in the private sector. We're, if you like, in the public sector business. And the real question for us is, in comparison to a private sector organisation, how do we create value? How do we know what we do? How do we demonstrate the power of our achievements? And that really is the focus of what I want to talk about today, which is to think about a language for how we can create and talk about the value of what we do. The kind of issue of values is not one that goes away. We find it way back in Shakespeare, but you also find it, if ever you've been recently looking for a job, in recruitment firms. The issue of our value proposition and how we create value is critical to everything we do. That's absolutely fine. We think we do a fantastic job. We know we create value, but what about the rest of the world? Their perception of the value we create is not always that good. I know that Sir Neil Cousins has been doing quite a lot of work in New Zealand. This was rather what Ken Livingstone had to say on Sir Neil Cousins. And an Australian planning minister, who shall remain nameless, unfortunately I've never found out his name, once said this. And you only have to Google museums on the web to find a whole range of fairly grim statements about the value of what we do. But if we think other people don't value us, what about ourselves? How much effort do we actually put in to thinking about our own value? Oh, we did an economic study, it didn't work, we didn't get the money, I don't know why we bothered. We don't have time to think about the value of what we do. But on the other hand, please will somebody give me some case studies to tell me what to do? It's a real conundrum for us. People don't value us. On the other hand, we don't spend a lot of time thinking about why we matter and how we matter and in what way we matter. So what I'm going to give you today is some language in thinking about value that has grown up over my career and has come out of the different things that I've done. I'm going to talk about 3 kinds of value, and it's what we covered in the workshop yesterday. The first will be familiar to many of you. It's this idea of significance, the value and meaning of the objects, the collections, the places that we care for. The second kind of value I want to talk about is very different. It's the idea of the benefits that flow from what we do. If you like, sustainability, the economic, the social and environmental benefits of caring for places. And the third kind of value I want to talk about is one that's actually just come home to me, having run an organisation for the last 5 years, which I'd never really thought about. And that's the value of us as organisations and the service we actually provide for people. So let's start with significance. And just to get you going, and because I don't really want to stand here for an hour, think about something that you've got about your person. It could be a tattoo, it could be a piece of jewellery, it could be something you're wearing, it could be something in your handbag, it could be a baby. Tell the person next to you, just quickly, why it matters to you. Go. Time's up. So, what were some of the ideas that came out of that? Give me a couple of words from the floor. Anybody? Sorry? Remind us. Something else. Money. Something else. Family. Other things. Kiwi. Significance. Other kinds of significance. Identity. Who we are. Commemoration. Traditions. In other words, there is a whole range of different ways in which things have meaning to us. And, it ranges from simple finance through to the very, very personal things about family and tradition. And as museums, we forget those values at our peril. I came to this idea of significance in my own way, but obviously the New Zealand Charter, which sets out this idea of significance, is an incredibly important and really useful document. And what you really need to understand is the power of approaches like this, which came out of New Zealand and Australia and are fundamentally influencing European conservation traditions. Because in Europe, heritage significance has always been, and I quote William Morris, who I love in many ways, significance is that over which any educated gentleman would agree. So the power of recognising different cultural values and the way in which different people value things is really, really important. My own approach to significance came because I was an archaeologist. I got my first job in 1985, working at the Ironbridge Gorge Museums. I was given the job of doing an archaeological survey. Fantastic. Except that the Ironbridge Gorge and the Industrial Revolution is full of history books. And everybody just looked at me and said, why are you doing archaeology when it's all written down in the history books? And that forced me to look at things, objects, places, buildings, landscapes, and really understand the stories that come out of them. And it made me realise that places and objects tell stories that you can't get out of history books. But the other thing that I learnt when I'm working there is that those stories are nice academically, they're great for connecting with audiences, but they also matter when you're coming to real decisions about the world around them. What you're looking at there is the demolition of the first iron-framed building in the world. Why is it being demolished? Because we didn't know its story. And that power of understanding the stories of places and things and why they matter is really core to what we do. And it's not just a luxury, it's something that can influence the world around us. So I wrote a book called Informed Conservation, which was trying to pick up on this idea of understanding places and things to help make good decisions, but also understanding their meaning. And that's something that I've brought from the world of archaeology and buildings and places into museums and collections. And if any of you haven't got a copy of this on your desks, please go and get one. It's a really powerful and wonderful guide to how you can use ideas about significance in collections. I left Ironbridge, I went to English Heritage, and I moved from there to a glorious thing called the Lottery, which was an organisation that was distributing funding to heritage in the UK. At the time, we had about £300 million a year to give out to heritage. It went down and then it went up again. It was fantastic. And the wonderful thing about it was it showed the power of what heritage can achieve for communities. But working at the Lottery, I came to work with a whole range of different kinds of heritage. With museums, which we funded biodiversity. And with each kind of heritage I dealt with, I realised that that story of significance works as a common thread in language. We can talk about the significance of species. We can talk about the significance of landscapes. We can talk about the significance of our industrial, maritime and technological heritage. And that language helps us to make good decisions. I also realised that significance is very powerful in connecting us to communities, into helping us to find activities that we can do in museums, and also in making that connection to people that enable them to get involved in caring for heritage. So that was the first lesson for me, that significance has got a power beyond archaeology, beyond the object, and to enable us to make connections. That's great, but what about other kinds of values? The next kind of value I want to talk about is this idea of benefits. I'm going to give you another exercise. Most of you work in and around museums in some way. Think about for me and tell your neighbour, what do you think the benefits of museums are? Go. And if you can't think, I'll see you later. So what are some of the words that we've come up with? Give me some examples. Somebody from the floor. Keeping communities together. That's really powerful, the sense of cohesion. Another one.
Education.
Education, learning, just for children?
No.
For lifelong learning. What else have we come up with?
Satisfying inherent curiosity.
That idea of inherent curiosity, I love it. The sense that we all want to know something. What else have people come up with?
A social space.
A social space. We don't always think of ourselves as social spaces. We think we're there to tell people, but actually it's surprising the social power of museums. What else?
Delight.
Delight. I love it. Firmness, commodity and delight.
Giving visual form to heritage with values and memories.
That's a tricky one, isn't it? This idea that there are intangible values and memories that we all hold, and how do you turn them into something that you can see and touch and feel? And that's, if you like, the exercise that we did with the thing that meant something to you. Other ideas?
Nostalgia.
Not what's wrong with good old-fashioned nostalgia. Anything else?
Learning by others' mistakes.
And haven't we all learnt from other people's mistakes? What do you think politicians want us to talk about when we talk about the value of museums?
Money.
Money. What do you think taxpayers want us to talk about when we talk about the value of museums? Value for money. So we've got very, very different agendas and very different ways of thinking about the value of museums. I came to this one when my job at the lottery involved not just providing advice on conservation, but actually heading up the team that dealt with the evaluation of our funding and what we'd achieved. And at that stage, we'd spent something like £3.3 billion on heritage. I think it's gone up considerably, because that was at least 10 years ago. And my job was to say, what do you get for that? What do you achieve with £3 billion worth of heritage? You can do the numbers. So you can start counting. You get, for your information, 10,000 historic buildings, 250 public parks, 3 times the size of the Isle of Wight worth of nature conservation. How do you measure conservation? And 290 spaces for learning in museums, plus quite a lot of other things. There's quite a lot of things that you get for your money. But the real question is, what difference did that make? Who benefits, and why do they benefit? And being an archaeologist, I actually knew nothing about how to do this, so I rapidly got help. And I got in captivity a wonderful guy called Gareth Meir, who was an environmental economist. And he understood the language of values, the language of economics, but he could also translate it into environmentalism. And he said, Kate, you've got to turn the whole thing on its head. You're looking at how many buildings you've conserved, how many objects you saved, and you think that's good enough. He said, no, you've got to think about it in a different way. You need to think about who benefits. And he said, look, The people who benefit from our funding, the visitors who come to our sites and museums, the people who take part in the heritage projects, the businesses, local businesses in and around where we are, and actually people in the area, the local community. And he set about giving us a really rigorous set of data and research and information that helped us begin to talk about those benefits in a way that, if you like, had heft, had numbers that worked. So what has heritage done for us, to quote Blackadder? We looked at things like visitors, what visitors got out of visiting a heritage site. And a lot of those words were about enjoyment, relaxing, imagination. We didn't score well on everything. You know, we only got 49% agreeing strongly that it was exciting and imaginative, and 34% agreeing strongly that things were inspirational. So we had a way to go. But this was the kind of data that we needed to collect to understand what people got out of heritage. We also talked to people who took part, and it was quite fun in the workshop yesterday talking to one of the volunteers about why she volunteered, why she took part, what she got out of being part of a museum organisation. And when we talk to people, well, for a start, that's a nice one, a better understanding of the value of heritage, which is always helpful. But that also that idea of identity and a greater understanding of our identity and that of others. One of my absolutely favourite all-time quotes in heritage is a man called Stuart Hall, and he says, "Heritage is a very powerful mirror. Those who don't see themselves reflected in it are therefore excluded." And this sense of a shared identity is something that comes out of this. But we also did economic impact assessments. We did the maths, we did the numbers. We looked at what happens when you spend money on heritage. And yes, we put money into local businesses. And yes, we were safeguarding existing jobs. And yes, we were creating new jobs, which is absolutely great. But it's kind of a bit more expensive to create jobs in a heritage site than it is if you build a supermarket. But there is more to regeneration and investment than just jobs. And one of the things we did, and this slide hasn't translated, is we went and talked to local neighbourhoods. We talked to people on the streets in and around where we had funded heritage projects and said, do you know about the project? What do you think of the project? What difference has it made to your life? And we got overwhelming responses with people saying, that project has made a difference to the quality of my life. So we're actually talking about things like well-being, happiness, and quality of life. I've got to tell you, parks score better than museums on that one, though. So don't get too excited. So if you like, you can think about a kind of quadruple bottom line for every pound in England that we were spending on heritage. On the one hand, yes, we were creating jobs, and I made these numbers up, but there are also social benefits, there are benefits to the heritage, and there are environmental benefits from some of the things that we're funding. That's great. I was really proud of that. I thought this is fantastic. I used it in briefings to ministers and all sorts of other things. And I thought, you know, we're really beginning to hum here. Until the minister asked a really tough question. And this idea that, you know, can't we move on? Can't we do something else? And I realised that we still hadn't told the story, to go back to Museum World, of what we'd achieved and what we'd done. And I went back to the work of one of my favourite thinkers. It's a guy called Mark Moore who actually makes this point about public institutions and creating value. And he says, look, you have to find your own language for the value you create. And you've got to tell it in a way that you can do it and you can achieve it. So, I hired a couple of consultants, as you do, one of whom was the arch heritage skeptic, which is Robert Hewison, who loves writing books about the appalling nature of the heritage industry. Always keep your enemies close. Your friends close and your enemies closer. And John Holden, who's a wonderful thinker about ideas of cultural value. And they came up with a report called Challenge and Change. It's on the web somewhere if you look for it. And it really looks at this idea of how heritage creates value. And they pull together these three different streams. One of the things that they drew on was the work of an economist called David Throsby. He works in Australia. He's a cultural economist. And what he says is cultural heritage is like capital. It's like money that you've got in the bank. If you invest in it wisely and you look after it, it'll pay dividends. But if you don't, you'll